The chamber of the Galactic Senate was an amphitheater of light and shadow, a massive arena suspended in the vacuum of space, glimmering with the refracted brilliance of distant stars. Delegates of 100 species occupied tiered seats that curved upward like a crescent moon, their features illuminated by floating orbs of pale blue light. The air buzzed with the susurration of alien tongues, a symphony of hisses, clicks, and guttural murmurs. At the center of this maelstrom stood General Mirith Vocara of the Dreyan sovereignty, her towering form bristling with a mixture of ceremonial armor and raw authority. "Counselors," she began, her voice slicing through the din like a blade, "we face a critical juncture. The humans, these newcomers, are a threat to the galaxy's stability. Their defiance of the concordance cannot be ignored." Her clawed hand gestured toward a hologram projected in the center of the chamber, a spinning sphere of deep blue and green, Earth. Around it orbited images of sleek, dark human warships, their designs angular and predatory, like vultures circling unseen prey. "They claim peace," Vocara continued, her slit-pupiled eyes narrowing, "but their actions belie their words. They hoard technology far beyond their apparent age. Their fleets linger on our borders, watching, waiting." A ripple of unease passed through the assembly, manifesting in flickers of bioluminescent scales, twitching antennae, and muffled growls. From the upper tiers, a delegate from the pacifistic Arivian High Guild spoke, her voice a mellifluous hum. "General Vocara, your argument presumes their hostility. Have the humans not shown restraint?" Their envoy spoke earnestly of coexistence during the last summit. Vocara's lip curled, revealing sharp, ivory fangs. "Restraint. A predator shows restraint only until it strikes. I do not propose waiting to find their claws at our throats." Another voice, deeper and resonant, emerged from a shadowed corner, a Zyran warlord, encased in iridescent armor that gleamed like oil on water. "The question is simple," he growled. "Can they be broken?" Vocara slammed a gauntleted fist against her chest. "The Dreyan fleet stand ready to answer that question." As the Senate descended into debate, the camera feed capturing their proceedings was intercepted aboard the Orion, a stealth reconnaissance vessel orbiting the edges of human territory. Commander Elias Vren stood in the observation deck, his silhouette a stark line against the soft glow of Earth, visible through the reinforced viewport. The air inside the Orion was thick with quiet tension, the kind that settled deep into the bones. Consoles hummed with restrained energy, and the faint metallic tang of coolant mingled with the sharper bite of coffee that had been abandoned on a nearby counter. Elias, a tall figure with sharp, calculating eyes, observed the Senate proceedings on a translucent holoscreen, his expression unreadable. "Play it back," he ordered, his voice low but firm like the pull of gravity. The Senate's conversation rewound and replayed, each word carefully scrutinized. Lieutenant Rhea Calton, seated beside him, tilted her head. "They're posturing," she said, her tone clipped but thoughtful. "They think we're some fledgling species punching above its weight." Elias's lips curved into the barest hint of a smile, a cold, distant thing. "Let them. But they're massing ships near the outer colonies," Rhea pressed. "That's not just posturing." Elias turned to her, his gaze steady, like a predator studying a rival. "Then we give them what they're looking for, a reason to hesitate." Rhea leaned back, crossing her arms. The overhead lights glinted off the faint scar running down her left temple, a memento from an earlier skirmish. "You've got a plan, I take it." "I always do," Elias replied, his tone as smooth and impenetrable as a sealed vault. He returned his attention to the viewport, his eyes fixed on Earth. It gleamed like a jewel in the void, deceptively fragile yet steeped in a history of bloodshed and survival that no outsider could comprehend. Below the surface, cities sprawled like intricate circuits, their neon veins pulsing with the lifeblood of billions. Yet in those streets and skyscrapers, no one knew how close they stood to annihilation. Humanity's strength was hidden, cloaked not just in stealth technology, but in the collective memories of generations who had endured and mastered war. Elias knew this intimately. It was why he was trusted to sit at the helm of Earth's military strategies. "Commander," a voice crackled through the comms, pulling him from his reverie. It was Lieutenant Anders, down in tactical operations. "Probes have detected a fleet entering the perimeter near Epsilon 12. Elias's jaw tightened. "Their numbers?" "Preliminary readings suggest 15 capital ships, multiple support vessels. No immediate signs of aggressive posturing, but they're close enough to keep us on edge." "Good," Elias murmured. "Let them come closer. Keep all units in passive mode." Rhea frowned. "Passive mode? If they're testing our defenses, shouldn't we—" "No," Elias interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "Not yet. If they want to see weakness, we'll show them just enough to make them overconfident." Rhea exhaled sharply, frustration flickering across her face. "And if they call our bluff?" "They won't," Elias said simply. He turned back to the holoscreen, where the Alien Senate's debate continued. "They think Earth is young. They think we're reckless, naive. Let's make sure they keep thinking that, for now." The minutes stretched into hours as the Orion monitored the encroaching fleet. Inside the ship, the crew worked with a practiced efficiency born of countless simulations. The soft beeps of consoles mixed with the faint hum of the ship's systems, a background symphony that kept them grounded amidst the vast emptiness of space. In the mess hall, where the scent of rehydrated rations lingered, Ensign Amir Kale sat with a datapad, studying the movements of the alien fleet. Beside him, Corporal Asha Hayer tapped her fingers against the table, the rhythm uneven and restless. "They're baiting us," Amir said, his voice quiet but laced with certainty. Asha snorted. "And we're just supposed to sit here and take it?" Amir glanced up, his dark eyes steady. "Do you doubt the commander?" She hesitated, her fingers stilling. "Number, but sitting in the dark while they inch closer? It's enough to drive anyone mad." "Patience," Amir said, the word carrying a weight that seemed far older than his years. "That's what separates us from them." The fleet near Epsilon 12 loomed larger on the Orion sensors, their formations tightening like a noose. Back on the bridge, Elias watched their progress, his hands clasped behind his back. His calm belied the storm brewing within him, a storm tempered by a lifetime of studying humanity's darkest moments. The Senate's words echoed in his mind, a chorus of arrogance and ignorance. "They think we're young," he murmured to himself. "But we've been here far longer than they know." Outside, the void stretched endlessly, cold and unfeeling. But for those who truly understood it, space wasn't just emptiness. It was a battlefield, one where survival demanded strategy, cunning, and a willingness to strike when the time was right. Elias Vren knew this. He felt it in his bones, in the marrow of his being. And as the alien fleet edged closer, he allowed himself one small thought, a shard of truth buried deep within the quiet chaos of his mind. They would learn. Soon enough, they would all learn. The void trembled with the faint ripples of distant movement. From the Orion's bridge, Commander Elias Vren stood like a statue carved from stone, his sharp gaze locked on the holographic map before him. The alien fleet crept closer, their ships glowing faintly against the stark backdrop of space, like embers threatening to ignite. Yet Elias remained impassive, his silence as heavy as the gravity well of a collapsing star. "Status update," he said, his voice a controlled cadence of authority. Lieutenant Rhea Kelton's fingers danced across her console, the soft hum of data streams filling the air. "They're holding formation. Steady advance. No signs of deviation. They're scanning, but nothing too aggressive." Elias let the words settle. Outside the viewport, Earth loomed large, a sphere of cerulean and ivory clouds, serene and unassuming. To the aliens it must have seemed like a docile lamb waiting for the slaughter. The reality was far more dangerous, a wolf cloaked in silence, its teeth hidden just beneath the surface. "Commander," Rhea pressed, her voice tinged with tension, "how long do we wait? The fleet's pushing deeper into the perimeter." "Until they commit," Elias replied. "They need to believe they've drawn blood. Only then will they expose their hand." Rhea sighed, but said nothing more. Her unease lingered, tangible in the room like the taste of static before a lightning strike. The crew around her moved with quiet efficiency, their faces pale under the cold fluorescence of the bridge. The air smelled faintly of recycled oxygen and the faint musk of metal, a reminder of how far removed they were from the green hills and open skies of home. On the Vandross, the flagship of the Drayan fleet, General Mirith Vocara prowled her command deck like a caged predator. Her clawed feet struck the polished floor with a deliberate rhythm, each step a beat in the war drum pounding within her chest. Around her, Drayan officers busied themselves at their stations, their translucent visors glowing with streams of tactical data. "Update," Vocara growled, her voice a low rumble that vibrated in the bones of her crew. "Human forces remain passive," her tactical officer replied, antennae twitching with uncertainty. "Their defensive stations are online but unmanned. No ships have moved to intercept." Vocara's lips curled in a predatory smile. "Cowards," she hissed. "They're hiding behind their walls, hoping we'll lose interest." Beside her, strategist Kalor, a spindly Arivian with shimmering silver skin, adjusted the collar of his uniform. His large liquid eyes blinked slowly, betraying no emotion. "General," he began, his voice measured, "the lack of resistance may suggest a trap." "Or weakness," Vocara snapped, silencing him. Her gaze returned to the tactical display, where the human fleet's apparent disarray mocked her. "Their fear is obvious. I will not let their hesitation poison my strategy." Kalor inclined his head, though the faint ripple of his bioluminescent scales betrayed his unease. "As you say, General." The fleet pressed onward, each ship a looming giant bristling with weaponry. The glow of their engines cast eerie shadows against the stars, and the faint tremor of their advance vibrated through the deck plates of the Vandross. The air on the command deck was heavy with the metallic tang of adrenaline, the scent mixing with the faint bitterness of coolant leaking from an overheated console. On board the Orion, Rhea's console beeped sharply, the sound slicing through the tense silence. Her eyes widened as she studied the data streaming in. "They're accelerating," she said, the words barely above a whisper, "pushing toward Epsilon 12 at full speed." Elias's gaze remained fixed on the map. The enemy fleet's movement was a tide, rushing forward with unchecked momentum, drawn to the promise of an unguarded outpost. But tides could be turned, he knew, with the right leverage. "Signal the decoy station," Elias ordered. "Activate the fail-safes, then stand by for Phase 2. "Yes, Commander." Rhea's fingers moved with precision, each tap a step closer to the trap springing shut. Deep in the cold recesses of space, the abandoned station at Epsilon 12 came to life. Lights flickered to a steady glow, and faint energy signatures pulsed outward like bait to a predator. It was a calculated move, the kind of calculated risk humanity had perfected through centuries of survival. On the Vandross, Vocara's tactical officer leaned forward, mandibles clicking in excitement. "General, the station is emitting signals, rudimentary defenses coming online." Vocara grinned, her teeth glinting in the low light. "They're making a stand," she said, her voice thick with triumph. "How noble! All ships, prepare to engage." As the fleet closed in, the station's defenses activated in full, automated turrets firing bursts of energy into the void. The shots were erratic, scattered, just enough to appear like a desperate attempt to repel the invaders. "They're barely coordinated," Vocara sneered. "Pathetic." But strategist Kalor's brow furrowed, his gaze narrowing as he analyzed the patterns. "General," he began cautiously, "the positioning of their turrets, it seems deliberate." Before he could elaborate, a blinding flash lit up the void. The EMP mines concealed within the station detonated in unison, unleashing a storm of electromagnetic energy. It rippled outward, an invisible wave that disrupted systems and plunged half the Drayan fleet into darkness. Consoles sparked and sputtered on the Vandross, and the hum of power dimmed to a strained whine. "What in the void?" Vocara roared, her claws digging into the armrest of her command chair. "EMP detonation!" the tactical officer shouted, panic creeping into their voice. "Shields down! Weapon systems offline!" Before the Drayan fleet could recover, human ships emerged from the shadows, their engines roaring to life like wolves leaping from the cover of night. The dark hulls gleamed under starlight, each vessel moving with predatory precision. Railguns fired, their slugs streaking through the void like meteors, ripping into the vulnerable ships with surgical precision. Explosions blossomed in the dark, their fiery plumes briefly illuminating the carnage. Elias watched it all unfold from the Orion, his expression unreadable. The crew around him moved with sharp focus, their voices clipped but steady as they relayed updates and issued commands. "Targets neutralized," Rhea reported, her tone steady despite the chaos on screen. "Their formation is breaking." Elias nodded. "Good. Maintain pursuit distance, but don't overextend. This is just the opening move." On the Vandross, Vokra clawed at her console, her rage barely contained. "How are they doing this?" she bellowed, her voice echoing in the stricken silence of the bridge. Kaelor, his calm now a veneer cracking under pressure, replied evenly. "It's not brute force, General. It's precision. They're outthinking us." Vokara's eyes blazed, but she said nothing. The tide was turning, and she could feel the weight of it crushing her chest, suffocating her pride. In the cold vacuum of space, the human ships withdrew just as quickly as they had attacked, vanishing back into the darkness. The battlefield was left littered with drifting debris, a silent testament to Earth's lethality. Back on the Orion, Elias's gaze remained on the viewport, his reflection faintly visible against the starlit expanse. He exhaled slowly, the sound of a whisper against the backdrop of the ship's quiet hum. "They've seen the first move," he said softly, almost to himself. "Now let's see if they're wise enough to understand the rest." The air inside the Orion was heavy with anticipation, a tangible weight that settled over the crew like a storm cloud poised to break. The scent of burnt circuitry lingered from an earlier power surge, mingling with the faint metallic tang of the ship's recycled air. On the bridge, the holomap glowed faintly, displaying the drifting remnants of the Drayan Vanguard fleet. Jagged edges of shattered hulls glinted like shards of broken mirrors against the void. Commander Elias Vren stood at the helm, his posture rigid, and his eyes fixed on the shifting hologram. Around him, the faint hum of recalibrating systems punctuated the silence, each pulse of sound a reminder of how precariously balanced the situation had become. "Damage report on enemy vessels," Elias ordered, his voice low but sharp, like a blade drawn in warning. Lieutenant Rhea Calton's fingers flew over her console, her movements precise despite the tension crackling in the air. 7 enemy ships completely neutralized, 4 crippled and retreating. The rest are regrouping, slowly. She glanced up, her expression tight. "We hit them hard." Elias's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though it carried no warmth. "Not hard enough." Behind them, Ensign Amir Kale murmured, his tone wary. "They're adapting. Look at their formations. They're pulling their remaining fleet into a tighter cluster, protecting their vulnerable ships." Elias nodded, his gaze narrowing. "They'll shift to defensive tactics now, but it's a facade. They won't withdraw completely until they're certain we've overplayed our hand." Rhea frowned, her eyes flicking back to her console. "And what if they don't? What if they're regrouping for a counterstrike?" "They are," Elias replied, his voice calm, almost unnervingly so. "But we'll be ready." In the distance, beyond the Orion's cloaked perimeter, the Drayan fleet flickered like a constellation of wounded stars. General Mirith Vokara prowled the bridge of the Vandross, her claws flexing against the armrests of her command chair. Around her, the crew moved with a frantic efficiency that betrayed their growing unease. The once commanding hum of the ship's systems had dulled, replaced by sporadic bursts of static and the faint groans of overtaxed circuits. "Status report!" Vokara snarled, her voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the metal plating beneath her feet. Her tactical officer, a wiry Drayan with slitted pupils that darted nervously, hesitated before speaking. "General, our forward scouts have been eliminated. Rear guard is reporting intermittent comms interference, likely jamming from human forces." "And our remaining ships?" Vokara pressed. her voice dangerously quiet. Functional but compromised, the officer admitted. Shields are at 30% across the fleet. Weapons systems, patchy. Vocara slammed her fist into the armrest, the sharp crack echoing across the bridge. Pathetic! We are the Dreyan sovereignty. We do not crumble under pressure from some backwater primitives. Strategist Kaylor, standing at her side, inclined his head, his voice as measured as ever. With respect, General, these primitives have proven anything but. Their tactics are unsettling. This is not a war of strength. It is a war of the mind. Vocara's lip curled, her fangs glinting in the dim light. Then let us see how strong their minds are when we crush what remains of their forces. Kaylor hesitated, his bioluminescent scales dimming slightly in what could only be described as doubt. General, the humans' restraint troubles me. Their fleet is large enough to annihilate us outright, yet they continue to strike with precision rather than overwhelming force. It suggests they are holding back. But why? For a moment, Vocara said nothing. Her gaze burned into the tactical display, where the glowing dots of human ships remained maddeningly scattered, their movements impossible to predict. The silence on her bridge was oppressive, broken only by the faint crackle of static and the rhythmic beeping of failing systems. They're testing us, she said finally, her tone a low snarl. They want to see how far we can bend before we break, but I will not give them the satisfaction. She turned sharply to her communications officer. Signal the fleet. Full advance. We will drive them from their hiding places. On board the Orion, the crew watched as the Dreyan fleet surged forward, their formation tighter, but their desperation palpable. Rhea leaned closer to her console, her brow furrowed. They're pushing straight through the debris field, no hesitation. Elias allowed himself a faint nod. Predictable. Rhea shot him a glance. Predictable? They're charging right for us. Exactly, Elias said. They're trying to force a decisive engagement, hoping we'll commit our forces to a direct confrontation. And we won't? Amir asked, his tone uncertain. Elias's gaze remained on the holomap, his voice calm but firm. Not yet. Let them believe they've gained the upper hand. Beyond the Orion's cloaking field, the Dreyan fleet pressed onward, their engines flaring with renewed vigor. The faint tremor of their advance reverberated through the void, a soundless pressure that seemed to reach across the expanse of space. Inside the Vandross, Vocara leaned forward in her chair, her eyes glinting with a savage determination. Target their lead ships. Force them to respond. But as the Dreyan cannons lit up the darkness, streaks of plasma cutting toward the human vessels, their intended targets vanished. The human ships scattered like phantoms, their movements fluid and unpredictable. Each time the Dreyan fleet adjusted their aim, the humans shifted again, their erratic patterns defying even the most sophisticated targeting systems. "What is this?" Vocara hissed, her claws digging into the armrests. "Why won't they engage?" Strategist Kaylor's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "They're not fighting us, General. They're hunting us." Back on the Orion, Elias watched as the Dreyan fleet's cohesion began to fracture. Ships veered off course, their movements growing erratic as they struggled to respond to the humans' relentless maneuvers. The holomap flickered with updates, each one a testament to the precision of Earth's forces. "They're falling apart," Rhea said, her tone tinged with both awe and unease. Elias nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's not enough." "What do you mean?" Amir asked, his voice tight. "They're desperate," Elias said. "Desperation makes them dangerous. We need to end this before they do something reckless." He turned to Rhea. "Deploy the drones. Full cloak. Let's finish this." The air on the Orion grew heavier as Rhea relayed the command. Across the battlefield, human ships released swarms of drones, each one equipped with advanced cloaking technology. They moved like shadows, weaving through the Dreyan fleet with surgical precision. One by one, they infiltrated enemy vessels, targeting critical systems and sowing chaos from within. On the Vandross, alarms blared as the ship's systems began to fail. Vocara's rage boiled over, her voice a roar that echoed across the bridge. "What is happening?" Kaylor's response was grim. "Sabotage! They're inside our ships. The realization hit Vocara like a physical blow. Her fleet was crumbling, not from overwhelming force, but from the relentless precision of an enemy that seemed to anticipate her every move. Back on the Orion, Elias watched as the Drayan fleet fell into disarray, their once imposing formation reduced to scattered remnants. He allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before turning to Rhea. "Phase 1 is complete," he said. "Prepare for the next move." As the Orion slipped further into the void, Elias's thoughts turned to the battle ahead. The Drayans were broken, but the true test was yet to come. And deep down, he knew that the galaxy had only begun to see what humanity was capable of. The hum of the Orion's engines was a steady presence, a reminder of the ship's momentum as it drifted further into the void. Commander Elias Vren stood at the center of the war room, his gaze fixed on the holographic table where glowing tactical maps displayed the fragmented remnants of the Drayan fleet. Around him, his officers moved with quiet urgency, their boots tapping against the polished floor. The air was thick with the faint ozone tang of recently activated equipment, mixing with the subtle hum of power coursing through the ship's systems. "They're scattering," Rhea Kelton reported, her voice cutting through the tension. "Half the remaining ships are retreating to regroup. The rest are holding position at the outer perimeter." Elias leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the flickering movements on the display. Each blip of light represented a ship, but to him they were more than targets. They were pieces of a puzzle, their positions revealing the enemy's growing desperation. "Patch me through to Fleet Command," Elias said, his tone calm but carrying the weight of authority. A nearby officer nodded, the faint crackle of comms filling the room as the connection was established. "This is Commander Vren," he began, his voice steady. "All units maintain cloaked positions. Do not pursue the retreating forces. Focus on disabling the perimeter guard. We don't want them retreating into the void. We want them corralled." The war room fell silent as his officers absorbed the command. Even Rhea hesitated for a moment before speaking. "You're letting them retreat? After everything?" Elias turned to her, his gaze sharp. "This isn't about victory, Lieutenant. It's about control. Let them believe they still have options. The more they think they're choosing their next move, the easier it will be to predict." She nodded reluctantly, though her frown lingered. Behind her, Ensign Amir Kale spoke up, his voice quieter but no less urgent. "And if they regroup? If they pull in reinforcements?" Elias straightened, his expression unreadable. "Then we'll show them what happens when they bring numbers to a fight they don't understand." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, as the crew returned to their stations. In the quiet that followed, the faint scent of burnt coffee wafted from a forgotten mug, mixing with the sharper metallic tang of the war room's recycled atmosphere. It was a stark reminder of their human vulnerabilities, a contrast to the machine-like efficiency with which they operated. Far from the Orion, General Mirith Vocara paced the bridge of the Vandross, her clawed feet striking the floor with an uneven rhythm. The faint, acrid scent of burned circuits lingered in the air, a testament to the damage her ship had sustained. Around her, the remaining officers moved with a frantic energy, their movements jittery and unfocused. The once pristine command deck was now dimly lit, with only the faint glow of emergency lights illuminating the fractured displays. "Status!" Vocara barked, her voice rough with frustration. Her tactical officer hesitated, their gaze darting to the failing displays. "General, the remaining ships are holding position, but our comms are still compromised. Reinforcements are en route, but it will take another rotation for them to arrive." Vocara's claws flexed, her frustration mounting. "Unacceptable. We cannot wait for reinforcements. The humans are exploiting our weakness. If we delay, they'll pick us apart." Kalor, her ever-cautious strategist, stepped forward, his silver scales shimmering faintly in the dim light. "General, I must advise against another engagement. Their tactics are unlike anything we've encountered. If we rush in unprepared—" "We die," Vocara interrupted, her tone venomous. "Is that what you think? That we cannot face them?" Kalor hesitated, his gaze steady despite her fury. "I think," he said slowly, that they've been preparing for this far longer than we imagined. The silence that followed was deafening. Vokaра's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, her mind churning with the implications. Around her, the bridge was a cacophony of static-filled comms and muted alarms, a symphony of chaos that reflected the state of her fleet. In the shadows of the void, hidden behind layers of cloaking and decoys, the human fleet prepared for the next move. Drones darted through the darkness, their cloaked forms invisible to even the most advanced sensors. Each one carried a payload of electromagnetic disruptors, designed not to destroy, but to disarm. They infiltrated the remaining Dreyan ships, their movements silent and deliberate. On board the Orion, Elias monitored the operation with a detached focus. The war room was alive with the faint hum of activity, the glow of the holomap casting sharp shadows across his face. Rhea stood beside him, her arms crossed as she watched the drone's progress. "They're pulling their perimeter closer," she observed, her tone tinged with unease, "trying to protect their remaining forces." "Which makes them predictable," Elias replied, his gaze never leaving the map. "They're closing themselves in. All we have to do is tighten the net." Amir stepped forward, his expression cautious. "And if they realize what we're doing?" Elias glanced at him, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "By the time they realize, it'll be too late." The drones struck in unison, their disruptors unleashing silent waves of energy that rippled through the Dreyan fleet. On board the Vandross, systems flickered and died, plunging the bridge into near darkness. Vokaра's roar of frustration echoed through the chaos as her officers scrambled to restore power. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice a sharp crack against the oppressive silence. Kalor's voice was steady, though his expression betrayed his unease. "They're disabling us, ship by ship." Vokaра's claws dug into the armrests of her chair, her fury a palpable force. "Enough! Signal the fleet. All ships, engage at will." But as the remaining Dreyan vessels moved to strike, the human fleet appeared, their ships emerging from the shadows like predators closing in on wounded prey. Railguns fired with precision, their slugs tearing through critical systems with devastating efficiency. Torpedoes streaked through the darkness, their silent explosions lighting up the void. The Orion surged forward, its engines a low, powerful hum that seemed to vibrate through the bones of its crew. On the bridge, Elias stood at the helm, his expression unreadable as he directed the assault. "Target their command ship," he ordered, his voice calm but carrying the weight of inevitability. "Take out their propulsion. Leave their comms intact." Rhea frowned but complied, her fingers moving across her console with practiced precision. The Vandross shuddered under the impact of the human strike, its engines sputtering as they failed. On board the crippled ship, Vokaра's rage turned to desperation. The taste of defeat was bitter on her tongue, a metallic tang that seemed to permeate the air. Around her, the bridge was a cacophony of alarms and panicked voices, the once mighty Dreyan sovereignty reduced to chaos. Back on the Orion, Elias watched as the battle came to a close. The Dreyan fleet was broken, their forces scattered and powerless. Yet his expression remained neutral, his focus unshaken. "This isn't the end," he murmured, almost to himself. "Not yet." The Orion hung in the void like a specter, its sleek hull blending into the darkness, a silent witness to the unraveling chaos. The Dreyan fleet was a shattered constellation, its remnants drifting aimlessly. On the tactical display, their disarray glimmered faintly, a galaxy's worth of pride ground into debris and failure. Yet, within the heart of the human flagship, Commander Elias Vren's face remained impassive, his gaze fixed on the blinking light representing the crippled Vandross. "Sir," Lieutenant Rhea Colton said softly, her voice tight with controlled urgency, "their command ship's propulsion is disabled. Life support is critical. They're vulnerable." Elias turned to her, his features shadowed by the glow of the holomap. His voice, when it came, was calm, deliberate. "Send the transmission. Let them know who they've underestimated." Rhea hesitated for only a second before nodding, her hands moving swiftly across her console. The hum of the ship's systems grew louder as the message was patched through, the distant murmur of activity from the crew fading into an eerie quiet. Across the ruined battlefield, human ships repositioned, their movements calculated and precise, like wolves circling the last remnants of a dying herd. On board the Vandross, General Mirith Vocara slumped in her chair, her once proud posture reduced to a tense, trembling hunch. The bridge was dim, lit only by the flickering glow of failing consoles and the faint red of emergency lights. Smoke coiled through the air, acrid and suffocating, stinging her nostrils and eyes. Around her, her officers moved sluggishly, their desperation hanging heavy in the air like the weight of 1,000 unspoken failures. "General," Kaler said, his voice quiet but steady, "we're receiving a transmission. It's human." Vocara's claws curled into fists, her fury only barely concealing the fear simmering beneath it. "Put it through!" The screen flickered to life, and the face of Commander Elias Vren filled the frame, his expression cold, his eyes sharp as if carved from glass. Behind him, the dimly lit war room of the Orion exuded an unsettling calm, a stark contrast to the chaos of the Dreyan flagship. "General Vocara," Elias began, his voice measured, every word carrying the weight of an unspoken warning, "you have fought well. Few can claim to have survived this long against us. But it's over now." Vocara bared her fangs, a futile show of defiance. "You underestimate the sovereignty, human. Reinforcements will come, your fleet will burn." Elias's expression didn't waver. "Reinforcements? You still believe this is a battle of numbers? Look around you, General. Look at your fleet. What remains of it? You've seen what we can do, and yet you continue to believe we're playing the same game as you." The silence that followed was a knife's edge, cutting into the fraying resolve of the Dreyan bridge crew. Even Kalor, his usual calm unshaken, seemed to falter, his glowing scales dimming with the weight of realization. "We didn't want this war," Elias continued, his tone hardening like steel tempered in fire. "But make no mistake, when we fight to end. We've been doing it for far longer than you realize, General. And every time we've learned, adapted, evolved." Vocara's eyes narrowed, her claws digging into the armrests of her chair. "Your arrogance will be your undoing." Elias leaned closer to the camera, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but it carried the force of a thunderclap. "Arrogance? No. You thought Earth was young, a fledgling world with no scars, no history. But we are the elders of this galaxy, General. We've walked through fire and ash, destroyed ourselves and rebuilt, again and again. While your kind clung to complacency, we were perfecting war." He straightened, his presence filling the frame like a shadow engulfing a dying flame. "This isn't arrogance, General. It's truth. And now, you'll have to decide how much of your fleet you're willing to sacrifice to learn the rest of it." The transmission cut out, leaving the Vandross bridge in suffocating silence. Vocara's claws trembled against the armrests as her rage collided with the grim reality of her situation. Around her, the faint crackle of failing systems was the only sound, each spark a reminder of how close they stood to annihilation. "General," Kalor said softly, his voice a thin thread in the oppressive quiet, "we cannot win this." Vocara turned to him, her eyes blazing with defiance, but the words she tried to muster fell away, unspoken. The truth was undeniable, written in the wreckage of her fleet and the precision of her enemy's strikes. Humanity hadn't just defeated them. They had dismantled them, piece by calculated piece. "Signal the fleet," she said finally, her voice hollow. "Order a retreat." Kalor hesitated, then nodded, his hands moving quickly across his console. The command was relayed, and the Dreyan ships began to withdraw, their battered hulls limping toward the void. Vocara watched as the tactical display dimmed, the retreating remnants of her once proud fleet a stark reminder of her failure. On board the Orion, Elias watched the Dreyan retreat with an expression of quiet satisfaction. The tension in the war room eased slightly, though the weight of the battle lingered in the air like an unspoken question. "Should we pursue?" Rhea asked, her voice cautious. Elias shook his head. "No, let them go. They've learned enough for now." Rhea frowned but didn't argue. Around them the crew moved with renewed purpose, their focus shifting from the battle to the aftermath. The faint hum of the ship's systems seemed louder now, a reminder of the fragility of even their own technological superiority. As the last Drayan ship disappeared into the void, Elias stepped away from the holomap, his gaze turning toward the viewport. Earth hung in the distance, a brilliant orb of blue and green, its serenity a stark contrast to the destruction they had wrought. "They'll remember this," Amir said quietly, stepping up beside him. "They will," Elias replied, his tone unreadable. "But that's the point. It's not enough to win a battle. They need to know what happens if they start another." Rhea joined them, her expression thoughtful. "And if they come back?" Elias's gaze didn't waver. "They'll come back. They always do. But next time they'll hesitate, and that hesitation will be our greatest weapon." The war room fell silent once more, the weight of his words settling over the crew like a shroud. Outside, the void stretched endlessly, cold and unyielding, a testament to the fragile balance of power in the galaxy. Elias turned away from the viewport, his expression as unreadable as ever. "Prepare the fleet for debrief, and send a message to Earth. They need to know what we've accomplished here." As the crew moved to carry out his orders, Elias lingered for a moment longer, his thoughts turning inward. The battle was over, but the war, the endless war of survival, of proving humanity's place in the galaxy, was far from finished. They had shown the Drayans their strength, their precision, their mastery of warfare. But more importantly, they had shown them the truth. Humanity was not a species to be underestimated. They thought Earth was young. But humanity was the elder all along, forged in fire and sharpened by centuries of survival. And now the galaxy knew it too.